Alrighty, welcome everyone to tonight's film program, which is The Life and Career of Billy Dee Williams. And contrary to what some of my coworkers are trying to say, I am not trying to kill Billy Dee Williams by doing a program about him. I won't say their name, but one of my coworkers, who is also a big Star Wars fan, has been like, "Why are you trying to kill Billy Dee Williams? Don't you know that doing a program on him is going to kill him?" And I think he was joking about the fact that um, last year, Todd and Ellie did a program on the great David Lynch, RIP, who we lost last year. And he said, "Well, this is because you did a program on him." And jokes aside, I think what did David Lynch in was the fact that he smoked 4 packs of cigarettes a day. Todd, would you dispute that?
I mean, even before this recent turn of events, it was already seen as a factor in why he was saying his health was gonna prevent him from being able to direct anymore. So
Yeah. Yeah, but rest in peace, David Lynch. He was not a guy whose work I enjoyed as much as other people did, but I had the utmost respect for him as an artist. And yeah, the man left his mark on American cinema, and we can't ignore that. But speaking of someone who has left a mark on American cinema by being a part of one of the biggest franchises of all time. We're going to talk about Billy Dee Williams. So, whenever I go to February, it is Black History Month. I always try to highlight um, a Black person who has had an effect on the film industry because Black people have been a part of the film industry almost since its inception. A couple of years ago, I covered Oscar Micheaux, who, by the way, there is a documentary about him coming out now, and a lot of his films are getting Blu-ray and 4K restoration. So they are going to be available in much better shape than they've been recently. Unfortunately, I think some of the ones of his might still be lost to time, but um, the idea that Black directors and Black creatives are somehow new to the industry or just came around in the 1970s, that is absolutely not true. But I was kind of mulling over who to cover this year, and initially I thought about James Earl Jones because when he died, of course, everyone talked about Star Wars and The Lion King, and I'm like, well, the man's had a very storied career. He's more than just Star Wars, but then I'm like, I feel like everyone's talked about him, and then I remembered um in the year before 2024, Billy Dee Williams released his memoir called What Have We Here? And I'm like, you know what, this guy has a lot of great stories. He's a really interesting character, and I don't think he's really gotten his due. So that's how I landed on him as a subject. And if you have not read What Have We Here, it is great. I don't know if there's an audiobook version of it. If there is, I hope he reads it, but you can read that book and just hear his voice when you're reading it. The guy has a lot of stories to tell, and he has lived a very interesting life. So, if you're not sure who this guy is, I'm assuming most people here have some idea. Um, he is, again, best known for Star Wars, but he's an actor. He had his own breakthrough performances. He was on Dancing with the Stars. He's released an album. He's a painter, which I didn't know until reading that book. And back in the 1970s, he was dubbed by Barry Gordy as the Black Clark Gable. And I mean, look at him. He's suave. He was a sex symbol back in the day. And honestly, the man is in his late 80s. Every time you see him in interviews, he is still the coolest guy in the room. But he was someone who was a sex symbol and a romantic lead at a time where not a lot of black men were really put in that role. And yes, he's Lando Calrissian, who is also just one of the coolest guys in the galaxy. I know it's not all Star Wars, but I'm a Star Wars fan. We are going to have to talk about Star Wars. So, Billy Dee Williams had, I'm just going to say, in many ways, a childhood that I would envy. So, grew up in Harlem, very diverse neighborhood, but he was near, look what he lived near Central Park. He was near the zoo, the Museum of Natural History. He was near the Met. And if you've ever gone to these, there is a suggested fee for the Met and the American Museum of Natural History, but you can also, at least it was when I was in college, you can say, I'm just going to pay $5 and they let you in anyway. But imagine being near all of that art and all of that culture. So that is something that clearly influenced him from a young age. And he also came from a family that loved art as well. His mother loved theater and acting to the point where she eventually started working in a theater. His sister was a ballet dancer. His grandmother, who lived with them, she was also someone who was very into the arts and would teach them about like painting and singers. And the father loved music. So he was from a really artistic family and a family that, even though they were working class and they're like, look, you're going to have to take certain jobs to survive and put food on the table, they also knew that art was something that enriched your life. Um, and as he put right here, I loved this quote, and this was from his book. At night, we sat together and listened to the radio. I thought of us as the all-American family. We really truly loved each other, which was good and necessary thing because those bonds were tested daily by the fact that we only had one bathroom. Um, but living in New York with someone who wanted to be artistic, it gave him fairly easy access, or one should say easier access than someone, say, living in, a small rural town in the Midwest would have. He could walk down the street and see a museum, or he could walk down to an audition. And he didn't always want to be an actor. He went to a special school for the arts when he was younger, and he initially envisioned himself being either a painter or a dancer, and he does still paint to this day, but he caught the acting bug fairly young. But not, thankfully, wasn't quite a child star, but he got his start when he was 7 years old, and that is a photo of him for this play, The Firebrand of Florence. So his mother at the time worked at the Lyceum Theater and got to know the producer that lived there. And when the auditions for it came up, he's like, hey, there's a opportunity for a child. It wasn't a big part. He only had a few lines, but he went up and got the role, and he loved doing it. Unfortunately, it didn't run that long, but that made him go like, "Oh, I like acting. This is a lot of fun." Although it wasn't always, sorry, one moment. There we go. It wasn't always easy for him to find acting gigs that really spoke to him, even as a child. So he says, um, when the Firebrand of Florence closed, all right. Several casting directors contacted my mother about seeing me for new productions, and my career might have continued were it not for an incident at the first audition I went on. I was given a page with a few lines of dialogue to read with the show's director, Burgess Meredith, which, if you're not familiar with him, great actor. He's probably best known for Rocky, also in a number of fantastic episodes of The Twilight Zone. The actor, who is also an accomplished figure on and off the stage of the theater world. I read the lines to myself until I got near the end and saw something that made me uneasy. I shifted my weight from one foot to the other, thinking about what I was going to do when I got the when we got the part. I didn't know. Ready? Meredith asked. I nodded, but without the same confident expression I'd had minutes earlier. I can't remember the play or the situation we were acting out, but at the end of our dialogue, Meredith said, quote, "Come out from under that shed." I was supposed to respond, quote, "Ain't I black enough?" or something like that, something that referenced my skin color in what I perceived as negative or derogatory manner. But I stopped reading and glanced nervously to the side where my mother stood before looking back at Meredith and the creative team sitting next to him. My heart was pounding. "I can't," I said. "What?" Meredith said. "Do you need help? Do you need some more time?" I shook my head. "I can't say this," I explained. "These words are against my people." He thanked me for coming in to read. I walked over to my mother and took her hand. Without saying a word, we walked out of the building and onto the street. She held my hand until we got to the bus stop. There, she looked me in the eye, smiled, and kissed my forehead. "It's okay, Sonny," she said. "You did the right thing." So even though a lot of opportunities were available to him, it was still the 1940s, and a lot of these plays were being written by white people, and uh, let's just say, probably weren't as forward thinking as we are now. And he made a choice at a fairly young age to just say, I'm not going to go for these particular types of roles. So he didn't go the full child star route, but he started acting when he was a little older after school, after college and high school, because he did like acting and he did like performing. And like many black actors of the time, they did not get their start in the theater. The theater world, Hollywood was still fairly let's say nice. Let's be nice and say gate kept. There were, of course, actors who were making some inroads at the time. Like in the 1950s, we had Dorothy Dandridge, but it was still very hard to get out there. There's also colorism was a factor. And even in some cases, there were a lot of actors who saw the roles being offered in Hollywood and said, I don't want to do that, versus in the theater. If you remember the program I did last year on Ozzie Davis and Ruby Dee, there were a lot of black playwrights who were writing plays for black people, and a lot of people who wanted to be creatives and performers saw the theater world as a better and more authentic way to express themselves and also not have to play a caricature for people. So got to start in Hollywood, not Hollywood, wow, on Broadway, or in the theater world, I should say, not entirely on Broadway. So he did stuff like The Cool World, A Taste of Honey, Boy in Black, Hallelujah Baby, which he worked with Leslie Uggams on that, and he kind of got in trouble with her. He played a joke on her. She didn't exactly find it funny. Um, but the two big roles for him came later in his career. One was where he had to play Martin Luther King Jr. in I Have a Dream, and then kind of connecting this with my initial choice for this program, he took over for James Earl Jones in August Wilson's Fences in 1987. And for him, he's just like, that might have been the biggest honor of his career, was like, oh wow, not only am I in Fences, which is a great play, I am taking over for James Earl Jones. But of course, and then he's like, oh, I'm taking over for James Earl Jones. These are some huge shoes to fill. All right. So he starts to make his film debut in the late 60s in The Last Angry Man. I believe he's even uncredited in that film. But he starts out getting bit parts in comedies like The Out of Towners, movies like The Final Countdown, but he gets his big his big cinema break comes with Lady Sings the Blues with Diana Ross. This the poster is from Hit, which he took it because he saw it as like, oh, this gives me a chance to be more of like a Steve McQueen character, a Charlton Heston type of character. And he was someone where he wanted to play the romantic lead. He wanted to be the action hero, and to kind of, and even said, to transcend like the racial boundaries that were there for him and a number of other black performers. But his big break, the thing that really like made him the star to be noticed, was not a theatrically released film. It was a TV movie, and one of the biggest TV movies at the time. It is still well regarded as one of the most famous TV films ever. Does anyone want to put in the chat if they think they know what it is? And I'm not seeing anyone in the chat, but you will very likely know the name of this film. Brian's Song. This is a film that even when I was getting into movies, like as a teenager, was put on the like, this is arguably up there with The Day After as the most famous made for TV movie ever made. And for anyone younger watching this show, back in my back in the day, I was about to say back in my day, because even back in my day, they were starting to phase out TV films. But I don't know. I was alive in the 90s. The TV miniseries was a thing. But made for TV movies did not have the scorn or the bad reputation that they had as we entered the late 90s and the early aughts. Like by the time I was a teenager, made for TV was not necessarily a sign of quality. But back in the 70s and 80s, a made-for-TV movie or a TV miniseries, and even into the early 90s, could still be a prestige TV event. Todd, if we ever do that Stephen King program, we will have to talk about all the Stephen King miniseries and how those were not just miniseries, those were event television.
Oh, yeah.
But Brian's Song was, I mean, I think if Brian's Song were made today, Brian's Song would be a theatrically released film. But Brian's song also qualified as event television at the time. So he's in this film. He's in it with James Caan. This was also James Caan right before The Godfather happened. So this is kind of James Caan's break as well, although Godfather's definitely the bigger performance. This is kind of the, oh, hey, look, he's starting to get out there. Um, it's about a Chicago Bears football player named Brian Piccolo. He has a battle with cancer and his friendship with Gale Sayers, who is played by Billy Dee Williams. This is considered one of the big male weepies of all time. I mean, there's always, when people talk about tearjerkers, they're usually talking about films that are more often than not aimed towards women. So a movie like Terms of Endearment, Titanic is considered a tearjerker, even though, might I remind people, Terms of Endearment was the second highest grossing film of 1983, right behind Return of the Jedi. I'm pretty sure more people than just women saw that. Same with Titanic. For a while, Titanic was the highest grossing movie ever made. But most people associate the idea of a tearjerker with movies for women. Not so with Brian's song. This is a manly film about two football players and their friendship, and yet people will cry, like guys will cry all the time. Um, so he even talks about the impact that this film has. And he said, Brian's song was bigger than any single award. It's in its own timeless category, as happens when movies they are beloved and important to people. Many years later, I was in Atlanta and a guy who looked to me like a stereotypical Southern redneck, burly, crew cut, warm blue jeans, pack of Pall Malls in his shirt pocket, walked straight up to me on the sidewalk outside my hotel. For a moment, I feared there might be trouble. But even though we'd never met, it turned out we were old acquaintances who had shared a deep experience once. Quote, I just wanted to tell you that I watched Brian's song, and I never thought this is a quote from this person, that a colored man would make me cry the way you did. He said, it changed me. He wasn't the only one who approached me. I remember being approached by another man in or around Atlanta when I was making a movie there in the 80s. In a baseball hat, overalls, and a flannel shirt, he looked like the last man who'd ever be in touch with his feelings, but he said, if I am feeling heavy-hearted, I will go to my library, lock the door, and watch Brian's song and have myself a cry. So, yeah, this is a film that has a long, a storied reputation as being not just a movie for guys, but a movie for guys where it's like, it's okay, you can have a cry. It's also not a bad movie. I'm not a football fan, but I'm like, this is good. It's got good performances. And as you can see here, very popular at the time. It was the highest rated TV movie of all time. And again, this is back then when a high rated, like when we think of a high television rating now, we think of like 10 million people watched it. This was back when there were only a few networks. This was tens of millions of people watching it. Or like, Todd, what was the final count of MASH? Wasn't it like
Uh,
100 million people?
Let me take a look at that.
Yeah. But this was something like, you know, 50 million people watched it. So this is not quite something we have anymore, considering a lot of entertainment is so siloed now. I think the only event that's watched by a majority of Americans now is the Super Bowl, which we just had last night. So imagine this TV movie having a Super Bowl level of viewership.
So we're talking
Oh,
like over 100 million in terms of the final episode of MASH.
yeah. Again, I always just like to tell people that, I mean, if you're older, you probably know what I'm talking about, but I do know that sometimes younger people watch this, and I don't think they can comprehend the idea of 100 million people all watching the same TV show anymore, because that's just not how our entertainment works. But going back to the movie Lady Sings the Blues and Mahogany. So these were the cinematic films, Lady Sings the Blues especially, that really put Billy Dee Williams on the map, not just as an actor, but as a romantic lead, as someone who was suave, as someone who was a sex symbol. And again, this was the 70s, where the idea of portraying a black man in a mainstream Hollywood film as a sex symbol was still kind of iffy territory at the time. They could be romantic leads or romantic figures. I think back, as an example, Sidney Poitier in Guess Who's Coming to Dinner. He is the daughter's fiance. He is a romantic lead per se, but he's also not someone who you really see sex appeal from. He's still fairly, I guess chaste would be a good word. Um, Whereas you watch Billy Dee Williams in these movies, you're honestly most movies he's in, the guy oozes sex appeal. Even Return of the Jedi. So Lady Sings the Blues is based on Billie Holiday and Diana Ross playing the lead, who I think a lot of people, after she was in The Wiz, which a lot of people felt she was miscast for, people kind of dismissed her as an actress, but I'm like, no, go back and watch Lady Sings the Blues. She actually is a good actress, and she elevates the movie over what it is. And she garnered an Oscar nomination for it, and I believe this was the same year Cicely Tyson was up for Sounder, which is the first time in Academy Awards history that two black women were up for Best Actress at the same time. Um, she's good in that. Mahogany is definitely not as good of a movie, but it's an interesting film in terms of who plays what. So in Mahogany, Diana Ross is a woman. She wants to be a fashion designer. She's discovered as a model instead. Whereas Billy Dee Williams is this activist who wants to go into politics. And you could almost kind of see in another film, and the man is the one who has the big career and then decides I'm going to go back to my roots versus in this one, he's the man in waiting for her. So it is kind of an interesting, especially for the 1970s, kind of a role reversal. I mean, the women's movement was happening at this point, so kind of looking at it in that context, like, oh, we're now seeing a lot of movies where like women have careers and they're like, well, do I need to have it on my own terms or am I just going to let everyone push me around? So it's interesting from that aspect, although in some circles, Mahogany is a beloved movie. It is kind of a gay classic. It's also a black film classic, but definitely not on the level of Lady Sings the Blues. But um, he had a really good chemistry with Diana Ross, and he did try to work with her afterwards. It was just one of those, the stars never aligned. But my gosh, speaking of stars, we're now getting to Star Wars. So the late 80s, he was kind of getting frustrated. He had had a couple of movies in the early in the decade that kind of broke him out. And he was like, okay, now I'm not quite getting the roles I want to get. Maybe he went back to theater. That's why he did the Martin Luther King, the I Have a Dream. But he was still like, huh, I need, something else. And someone reached out to him about, hey, would you like to be in the sequel to Star Wars? And of course, you say yes, I would like to be in the sequel to Star Wars. I mean, keep in mind, this is when, 1977, Star Wars was the film to see. Everyone saw Star Wars. My mother saw Star Wars, and she doesn't even watch science fiction. I'm pretty sure my dad saw Star Wars. But it's like, that's the movie everyone watched. So, this is from his book. He talks about, he's going into, um, you know, kind of like, oh, this is like why he did it. Sorry, just trying to find a spot. Yeah. So of course he was trying to find a romantic film, but he's like, well, if I can't get a good one at that, I want to go against type and I want to work with a lot of great directors. So in the 1970s, we also had the birth of a lot of, well, late 60s, early 70s of new American cinema. And we have a lot of these visionary directors or who broke out, people like Martin Scorsese, Francis Ford Coppola, and yes, George Lucas. So he's like, all right, I'm going to do this. So he was going to work on a project with Barry Gordy. And he says, one day I come home from working out and my manager called me with news every actor dreams of hearing. He said George Lucas was interested in me for a sequel to Star Wars. I heard George Lucas and said, I'm in. So, actually, this is an interesting thing to talk about. Recently with Star Wars discourse, there's been, people angry that the Star Wars casts are a little more diverse than they used to be. And they're like, well, this wasn't an issue back in the 1970s, which actually isn't true. When Star Wars came out, there were a lot of people who were like, okay, you can have like all of these colorful aliens and different types of species, but all of the people are still white. So that was something people brought up in 1977. So this is from What Have We Here. He says, quote, George addressed the race issue directly. He was aware of the discussion about the lack of black characters in Star Wars other than Darth Vader, but he explained it was something manufactured in the press and that the story he created was a timeless battle between good and evil, like old cowboy movies in which the good guys wore white hats, the bad guys wore black hats. I understood him and um, told him that making a statement as the first black actor in Star Wars wasn't on my radar, even though others might have it on theirs. I explained that to me, Lando Calrissian sounded Armenian. He wore a cape. He was like nobody else. Quote, I'm thinking of myself as a man of the future, I said, making sure he understood that I only had one thing on my mind. I was going to enjoy the ride into the Star Wars universe. He kind of, so when he talks about what appealed to him about Lando's character, it was the fact that race didn't quite play into it. He's like, oh, I'm just being cast as a person. So he kind of said, I want to move away from the afro. I kind of want to style him. Again, kind of going with the black Clark Gable look. And he likened Lando more to an Errol Flynn archetype than anything else, especially with the cape. So he's in The Empire Strikes Back, and I assume we've all seen The Empire Strikes Back and how The Empire Strikes Back end. Let's just say Lando doesn't come out looking exactly great. But that is also another thing that drew Billy Dee Williams to this role. He's like, okay, I have to assume reading the script that he's got something else going on, but he's like, there's layers to this character. I can play him differently. I can keep something close to the chest. So he had fun playing him, and he's like, of course, Return of the Jedi is going to come out, and I'm here. But he did have to withstand 3 years of the public hating him. And he did kind of go like, it damaged my career a little bit because people like, oh, well, now everyone just knows you as the man who betrayed Han Solo. And even his poor daughter, who was, I think 7 years old at the time, she was going to school and there were kids going, your dad betrayed Han Solo. How dare he? So he was like, "Oh no, this isn't great." But of course, he told everyone like, "Don't worry, there's another movie coming. Things will be okay." And I assume we've also all seen The Return of the Jedi. Lando Calrissian absolutely redeems himself. Not only did he have a plan to get Han Solo out of Jabba's palace, he helps, he becomes a full-fledged member of the rebellion. He helps take down the Death Star. It's great. Actually, last month, Todd and I went to a screening of Return of the Jedi at Coolidge. It was packed. Everyone was having a great time. And, one of the reasons I think Return of the Jedi succeeds, even though it's definitely the weakest of the three movies, is Billy Dee Williams is there, and the man is just a fountain of charisma. And he's also playing against other fountains of charisma like Carrie Fisher and Harrison Ford. And you can just tell he is having an absolute blast in these movies. So we're moving on to the 80s. Again, like The Empire Strikes Back and Jedi are big for him, but he has a little bit of a hard time finding a foothold in the cinema world. So he goes to television. He goes one of this still is from Dynasty, where he worked with the great Diane Carroll. Actually, if you want to see, going back to James Earl Jones, a great movie with James Earl Jones and Diane Carroll, great film called Claudine, which we do have at the library. He would go on Sesame Street. He did a lot of TV spots. He would do TV movies. And again, this was the 1980s. TV movies were things that were just on TV. It wasn't quite seen as oh, this is beneath you. But he still, you look at some other people who went into Star Wars, didn't have the same success. He's an actor. A lot of actors, they don't quite have the Harrison Ford trajectory of being in a movie and then becoming a megastar. Most actors take the job because they need to work. But at the end of the 80s, he gets another shot at a franchise, and that is Batman. So, Todd, if we're going to talk about what is old is new again, the when Tim Burton was announced to direct Batman, that was not quite well received, was it?
On several levels, no.
Oh no. Yeah, because keep in mind, Tim Burton at the time only had two movies under his belt, Pee-wee's Big Adventure and Beetlejuice. That doesn't quite sound like a man who would direct a Batman movie, and a lot of fans at the time were worried that we were going to get like a campy 60s Batman instead of a more serious Batman, which by the time the 1980s had rolled around, people were starting to have some more serious superhero stories again. And the casting of Michael Keaton was not exactly well received either, which again, you think about it now, considering Keaton's a very beloved Batman. At the time, people were like, you mean the guy who was in Mr. Mom? How's he going to be Batman? How's he going to be Bruce Wayne? Which, turns out he's a great Bruce Wayne because he plays Bruce Wayne as a weirdo, which absolutely works when you really think about it. Um, but Burton decided in terms of who he's going to cast as Harvey Dent, which Todd, you want to give a quick rundown on who Harvey Dent is if people aren't really into the Batman lore?
So, as you can kind of see with the image here, Harvey Dent was kind of the, let's call it before he was famous version of the character when he coming out with the Batman villain Two-Face. He was
Mhm.
a up-and-coming district attorney, very well-liked politician with kind of a dark side. Defaced by the mob when they hopped after he tried to put one of them away. They threw acid in his face, and he kind of had a mental breakdown. He becomes this duality-obsessed villain, which, as again, it's a gimmick they play to the hilt here.
Yes. So he gets the role of Two-Face, and he's like, oh, again, he doesn't get the role of Two-Face. He gets the role of Harvey Dent. He's like, I like this character. He's like, I've read the comics. I know where it's going to go from here. So he signs on to 1989's Batman, thinking kind of the way people sign on to the Marvel movies now, i.e., I may be a side character now, I'll have my own movie or be the main villain down the line. That did not exactly happen for him. So Return comes out. Harvey Dent isn't even in it. Instead, we have Catwoman with Michelle Pfeiffer. We have Christopher Walken in it, and we have the Penguin played by Danny DeVito. Which, by the way, three great performances. But he was kind of like, okay, all right, I guess something else is going to happen. And then, due to the not so great reaction of Batman Returns made money, but Batman Returns made a lot of people upset because people took their children to it, and they didn't realize that hey, maybe a PG-13 movie might not be appropriate for a 5-year-old. I'm sorry, parents, that's on you. Um, but Tim Burton did not direct any more Batman movies after that. It then went to Joel Schumacher, and then Tommy Lee Jones was cast. Which, to Williams's credit, in his book, he's like, "Hey, Tommy Lee Jones is great. He did a great job. I just wish I could have had a shot at that performance because I would have loved to have done it." But he did finally get a chance to be Two-Face years later in the Lego Batman movie, in 2017. He doesn't have a lot of lines in it, but it's a nice shout out to him and kind of a, hey, we know cinematically you were the original Harvey Dent. Um, I also would just recommend the Lego Batman movie. We watched it over the weekend again. It's a hoot. It's adorable. But this is another case of he kind of has something that seems like a launch pad, but doesn't quite get him into the stratosphere. So in the 1990s, this was probably the most difficult decade for him. I found an old interview in, I believe it was People in 1997, where they're kind of talking about like, oh, well, opportunities for black actors, and he did talk about, racism is a thing. And he said like even though the 90s we had a lot of black actors get their rise, there was still kind of an idea of okay, we have five black actors, we're just going to call these five black actors instead of really opening it up. I've kind of likened it to how Hollywood was with older women for a while, where it's like, well, we're casting Meryl Streep in a movie, and it's like, yes, but there are other older actresses as well. So this is not exactly the best decade for him. The movie Giant Steps was one he was actually that was his big passion project for him. And sadly, I don't even believe that's in print anymore. But at the same time, again, if Hollywood itself didn't work out on the big screen, he went to the small screen. He guest starred on Living Color, went on A Different World, went on Martin, and he actually played Barry Gordy, who was a manager for him for a while in the TV movie for the Jacksons. So into the new millennium, he kind of leans into being the Billy Dee Williams persona. He kind of realizes at this point he's known as Billy Dee Williams and is kind of like, why not play it up? So that's kind of how the um Colt 45 thing comes up. He's just like, look, I am known as a suave, sexy man. Why don't I just play this as a spokesperson and make some money for it? Um, so he does that, and he does still makes movies. He still does TV shows. He was on Dancing with the Stars. Unfortunately, he was out first, but he can probably still dance better than I ever could. And he said like, you know what? I'm known as Lando. I may as well like lean into that and again, make some money, make some residuals. Again, most actors are not making the Brad Pitt money. Most actors, even actors you see in a number of films, they don't make nearly as much as you think, and the gigs are never as consistent as you'd want it to be. So it's like, yeah, go make that money, get yourself kind of a landing, a safety pad, as it were. Um, and he did eventually return to Star Wars in Star Wars Episode 9, Rise of the Skywalker. Uh, a movie that is not well liked by a lot of Star Wars fans. However, even when people are not happy with the movie, a lot of people are like, "Oh, Billy Dee Williams is the bright spot in this film." I remember one of the podcasts I listened to, We Hate Movies, one of the hosts, he was kind of just like, "Yeah, Last Jedi's not good. However, there is one bright shining moment, and that is seeing Billy Dee Williams' beautiful face again." And they all commented, they're like, "This man is how old, and he still looks great." And still fits into that world really well. So, again, he's more than Star Wars, but at the same time, if Star Wars keeps food on the table, how can you blame the guy for continuing to go back? All right, and personal life, he has been married 3 times. He has said he's just he said his problem is he loves women a little too much, i.e., he's not exactly the most faithful person on the planet. You read enough about a lot of famous people and historical figures, you're like, that seems to be a problem a lot of people have. But when he was younger, he was married to Audrey Sellers. They divorced sometime in the early 60s. So his son Corey was born to Audrey in 1960. His book is not exactly clear when he divorced Sellers. It's somewhere between 62, 63, and he was getting involved with other people at that point in time. For him, the biggest problem was his trying to be an actor and trying to be in multiple places at once. Married Marlene Clark, divorced her in 1971, and he married Taruko Nakagami in 1972. They filed for divorce, but they reconciled. They're still kind of together. It sounds like their relationship might be kind of open, but they still enjoy each other's company. Who might a judge? And his other child is Haruko. She was the one who had to deal with all of her classmates saying, "Your dad betrayed Han Solo." Which I feel bad for her. Imagine being 7, going to school saying, "You guys, my dad's gonna be in Star Wars," and then it comes out, and then your dad becomes one of the most hated people ever. Poor kid. I can't blame her for just being like, "Oh no, my dad being in Star Wars ruined my life." In that photo is him and his daughter with one of his grandchildren. And if you read his biography, if you read What Have We Here, he talks about a lot of the people he kind of grew up knowing, especially being based in New York, and one of them was James Baldwin, the writer and essayist, and him having a friendship with him, which I would not have known had I read this. And other talents. So I'd mentioned it before. He enjoyed painting and would do it semi-professionally in art school. Um, so in the late 1980s and into the 90s, when he wasn't quite finding all of the Hollywood work to be that satisfying, he's just like, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to get back to painting. And he's been consistently painting since then. His work's been displayed, it's been exhibited. You can buy it if you want. This is a self-portrait that he painted himself. In the 60s, he did release an album. I had tried to track it down. I couldn't quite find it or verify that it was actually him. Because sometimes people can just put stuff up on YouTube and archive.org and say this is it, and I'm like, not sure it actually is it. And again, as I mentioned before, he's probably the most recognizable spokesperson for Colt 45. But again, hey, advertising is it gets you money, and I'm not gonna hate the person for playing the game. Um, weren't those ads like really big in Japan, Todd, or am I imagining that?
I'm gonna be honest, I'm actually not sure on that one. I would have to look into that.
I know, I mean, for people Todd and I's age, elder millennials, like late 30s into early 40s, the Colt 45 ads became memes before memes were really a thing. Like they're oft quoted. I think I heard the works every time before I even knew what Colt 45 even was. I was just like, "Oh, it's the Star Wars guy." Okay. Yeah, whatever he's selling, I believe that. But he's in, to this day, he's still going strong. Again, this past year in 2004, he released his memoir, What Have We Here, which we do have here at the Derry Public Library. It's free to check out. And the book actually opens up with him telling the reader to sit with him, grab a glass of wine, and listen to some stories. And that is pretty much what the book is. You're just listening to a guy who has had a fairly storied career where he's crossed paths with a lot of different and well-known people, tell a lot of great stories. And I would really recommend it. It's here at the DPL, and hopefully he is with us for a very long time, not just because I think he is a treasure, but because I really don't want my coworker to be teasing me about killing Billy Dee Williams for as long as I work here.
I mean, if you want to also point out as a counter on that one, Werner Herzog is still alive and kicking.
Yeah, Werner Herzog's alive, John Waters alive, Martin Scorsese is still with us, so you know. I think Billy Dee Williams will be with us for a while as well. Like he seems like a guy who takes care of himself. And with that, does anyone have any questions? All right. Well, okay, with that, I do just want to give a quick rundown of some of the next programs we're doing. So next month, I'm going to be talking about Agnes Varda. She's a French director. She might be considered your favorite director's favorite director. A lot of new women directors really cite her stuff a lot. Martin Scorsese is a big fan of her. And in April, we're going to be talking about Bong Joon-ho, who directed Parasite, Snowpiercer. He has a new film coming out, Mickey 17. He's actually one of my favorite directors. And I think we are going to make May, Todd and I are going to tackle that Stephen King program, Stephen King on screen. So if you're a spooky movie fan or just like Stephen King, join us for that. We don't have to say that for October. I think we can just do it. And so with that, Todd, would you like to give for the few people remaining who we think is going to win at the Academy Awards this year? Because the Oscars are on, what's it, the second?
Yes.
Yeah, they're second, hosted by Conan O'Brien, one of my favorite people on the planet. Um, been a fan since high school. So Todd, who do you think is going to win? Let's just say the big five: actress, actor, director, screenwriting, and picture.
Actor, again, more and more, I'm feeling like, barring a long shot chance that Fiennes and Brody cancel each other out and Domingo goes across the line, I think this is going to be Ray Fiennes' year. Brody had a lot of heat going in, but I think the AI controversy has really cost that movie a lot. Best actress, again, I know I said this before, it bears repeating. This is Demi Moore's to lose at this point. As far as best director, I honestly I feel like this is gonna be it's looking like Sean Baker's probably got this one.
I can't contain myself, but okay.
Writing, I'm gonna be honest, especially because we recently rewatched it, I am really feeling the substance for best original screenplay. I don't know if it's necessarily I'd say it's a lock, but I think it's got the chops to go there. Best picture, at this point, I feel like it is a dead heat between Honora and Conclave. The two other biggest challengers have both aimed out, which, again, I'm going to laugh if Conclave takes it because it is going to be another great meta win moment because two of its biggest challengers basically scandaled themselves out of the running.
Mhm. Yeah. I think Best Actor might still be Brody. I think he might have a little more, he still might have heat, and he is really good. Um, I am going to echo my friend Ellie, who said if you bet against Demi Moore for Best Actress, you're insane. I think she's correct. Best Director, especially since he just won the Directors Guild Award, I think it's Baker's year, which is someone who's been a fan of Baker for 10 years at this point. I'm so happy. Best Screenwriting. I think it is a knockdown drag out between Honora and the Substance at this point, but considering I don't know if the Writers Guild Awards yet. I feel like the Academy might just still give it to Honora. It might edge out the Substance a little bit, but I could see the Substance winning. I just think it's going to be Honora, and I think more and more it's looking like Honora is going to be Best Picture at this point, barring something else crazy happening. I don't know. This has been an insane award season, but it's also been one of the more interesting ones in years. So we'll see if any if there is one thing you should put if you want to put money on anything this year, it's Demi Moore winning Best Actress. I don't think there's any world where she doesn't at this point, and well deserved, honestly. I love Mickey Madison, but yeah, this is I'm just hoping that Ariana. I never thought I'd say these words. I will say this now. I want Ariana Grande to win Best Supporting Actress. She's so good in Wicked. She rules. Like she understood the assignment. Um, and every time I watch Wicked, she makes me like roar with laughter. But we know the Academy feels about comedic performances, so I think that's going to be held against her, which is a shame. But yeah, I have been on Team Minora since the movie came out, and I'm still Team Minora and Team The Substance. So, with that, have a good night, and we will see you next month for Agnes Varda, your favorite director's favorite director. And have a good night, everyone.